Welcome to another episode of Becoming a Techno Wizard. And today we're continuing our series on learning about Hegel. And today we finally get into the introduction. The introduction. We just finished the preface last episode, whatever day that was. Um, so we're gonna go ahead and you know I'm gonna goodness say the summary of the last episode, my summary, and then Dr. Hegel's, and then we'll jump into the introduction. So here we go. My summary was as follows. I said, we finally wrap up the preface in these last two sections with Hegel poking at his critics and intelligentsia, claiming that they will try to dismiss his work for being too difficult to understand. He says he is writing this for the public, who usually have more humility about philosophy, to gain the tools to go through the phenomenology. He insists that he just happens to be in the best time and place to see and discuss the history of humanity. But knowing what we know today, I'd say Hegel was unfortunately very much limited in what he could see about human history, even in his own time, due to the Eurocentric view of the world many European philosophers had and still kind of have at the time. He ends the preface asking us to focus less on the individual and more on the systems, which is something I do greatly agree with. And what's interesting too is like I happened to find a video um, earlier this week about Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer, I think that's how you say his name. Schopenhauer, I don't know. But apparently he hated Hegel, and for this very reason that he thought that Hegel wrote things very in a very unnecessarily complex way. So he was exactly this intelligentsia that Hegel was worried about. But it seemed that for the most part, many other people actually did like Hegel, and he was very famous and popular for his sort of work. So interesting. But let's see what Dr. Sadler says. So he says the for the preface, we bring the study of the preface to a close and prepare to start the introduction to the work by looking at Hegel's predictions and explanations for what he takes to be the likely reception for his work. He also reflects on the nature of timelessness and historical progress, arguing that the time has come at last in modernity for philosophy to become truly scientific and meet a public ready to carry out the work to understand it. Yeah. So that was a great way to preface it or way to summarize it there. So we're gonna go ahead and jump into the introduction. So here we go, and let us begin. Different music.
It is a natural assumption.
I'm sorry, but that was a bop right there. I'm sorry. I need to listen to more classical music. I listen to a little bit every now and then, but I haven't really gotten to it. My favorite is like when hip hop artists, or freaking electronic artists, bring some of that orchestral stuff in there, like Apache, however you say his name. He has just phenomenal how he brings the classic with the electronic. Oh my gosh, it's amazing. Like for that, I just heard some drums in the background. Just it was beautiful. I know that's probably a blasphemy for people who like classical music, but whatever. Anyways.
Assumption that in philosophy, before we start to deal with its proper subject matter, that is, the actual cognition of what truly is, one must first of all come to an understanding about cognition, which is regarded either as the instrument to get hold of the absolute or as the medium through which one discovers it.
Mm.
A certain uneasiness seems justified, partly because there are different types of cognition, and one of them might be more appropriate than another for the attainment of this goal, so that we could make a bad choice of means. And partly because cognition is a faculty of a definite kind and scope, and thus, without a more precise definition of its nature and limits, we might grasp clouds of error instead of the heaven of truth.
Mm.
This feeling of uneasiness is surely...
Hold up. Let me look at that again. So yeah, certain uneasiness seems justified partly because one of them might be more appropriate than the other for the attainment of this goal, so that we could make a bad choice of means. And partly because cognition is a faculty of a different kind and scope, and thus without a more precise definition of its nature and limits, we might grasp clouds of error instead of heaven. Yeah. So to me, it seems like it's hard, right? Like going back to what you were saying earlier, um, creating a good philosophy is a struggle. Is difficult, and this is why, like, there's some, um like you said, uneasiness. There's another word for this, like, almost anxiety type of feeling. I forget that there's a really good word for this. I'm mad I'm forgetting it, but it's like this, almost like this creepy crawly feeling, or like this unbalanced feeling. When you're doing something that's unknown or that you're unsure about, that uncertainty. The human mind has a very big problem with, grasping uncertainty. And to some people, that is expressed in a way of like going towards it because you want to figure it out and understand more. But also, for other people, it could be pulling back away from it, right? um but here also, like, the fact that it's not definite, right? Partly because cognition is the faculty of a definite kind and scope, and thus, without a more precise definition of its nature and limits, you might grasp. So we don't. It's like when you don't know, what is possible here, right? You don't know what the scope is. You don't know if it applies to everything or nothing or this or that, and because of that, you can. We always like have this idea that there's a little bit of a margin of error for whatever type of advice or philosophy or way of thinking that we have. But when you're in a new kind of space, those margins of error could be huge or it could be small. It could be, like you said, this cloud of error instead of the heaven of truth, like this. Instead of knowing that this is definitely what you're looking for, it could just be you just grasp a bunch of nothing. So I don't know. Something about that really spoke to me, so I wanted to touch on
Clouds
that.
of error instead of the heaven of truth. This feeling of uneasiness is surely bound to be transformed into the conviction that the whole project of securing for consciousness through cognition what exists in itself is absurd, and that there is a boundary between cognition and the absolute that completely separates them.
Mm,
For if cognition is the instrument for getting hold of absolute being, it is obvious that the use of an instrument on a thing certainly does not let it be what it is for itself, but rather sets out to reshape and alter it. If, on the other hand, cognition is not an instrument of our activity, but a more or less passive medium through which the light of truth reaches us, then again we do not receive the truth as it is in itself, but only as it exists through and in this medium.
mm,
Either way, we employ a means which immediately brings about the opposite of its own end, or rather, what is really absurd is that we should make use of a means at all. It would seem, to be sure, that this evil could be remedied through an acquaintance with the way in which the instrument works, for this would enable us to eliminate from the representation of the absolute, which we've gained through it, whatever is due to the instrument, and thus get the truth in its purity. But this improvement would in fact only bring us back to where we were before. If we remove from a reshaped thing what the instrument has done to it, then the thing, here, the absolute, becomes for us exactly what it was before this accordingly superfluous effort. On the other hand, if the absolute is supposed merely to be brought nearer to us through this instrument without anything in it being altered, like a bird caught by a lime twig, it would surely laugh our little ruse to scorn if it were not with us, in and for itself, all along, and of its own volition.
mm,
For a ruse is just what cognition would be in such a case, since it would, with its manifold exertions, be giving itself the air of doing something quite different from creating a merely immediate and therefore effortless relationship. Or if by testing cognition, which we conceive of as a medium, we get to know the law of its refraction, it is again useless to subtract this from the end result.
mm.
For it is not the refraction of the ray, but the ray itself whereby truth reaches us. That is cognition. And if this were removed, all that would be indicated would be a pure direction or a blank space.
So that was a lot of interesting stuff there. There was a thought I had, which is completely almost unrelated, but I don't know. Let me see if I can bring it back here. It's crazy. This is why another reason why it's so interesting that Hegel thought he was like at the moment, to make all these things. I think, now, granted, I'm only into the first paragraph of the introduction, so I don't really understand exactly what Hegel was saying. But if he's looking at philosophy from a historical sense, right, um, from the progress of history up to that point, then really every time afterwards you will be at a better point to see the progress of history and philosophy, right? So the people who came, a generation after Hegel would have a better time than he did, and so on and so forth, up to where we are today. So we have a great time, even better than Hegel, and then somebody after us will probably even have a better time, you know, um, assuming that humanity didn't, collapse or something like that. But nonetheless, something about this is calling back to what I've been reading recently, or I've been learning more about, which is Don Hoffman and his case against reality. Now I know this is completely almost unrelated, but there's some ways that is related here. Um, Something specifically it said for cognition's instrument for getting hold of absolute being, it is obvious that the use of an instrument on a thing certainly does not let it be what it is or itself, but rather it sets out to reshape and alter it. If, on the other hand, cognition is not an instrument of activity, but more or less passive medium through which the light of truth reaches us, then again we do not receive the truth as it is in and of itself, but only as it exists through and in this medium. So to me, this relates to Don Hoffman's theory of that space and time is not fundamental, and that at the fundamental level is consciousness, right? Consciousness being, this tool of self-awareness and um, phenomenology of experiences and things like that. And this may seem completely out the wazoo for people. Like, this is not really a panpsychist thing, but go look up Don Hoffman. Go check out Lex Friedman's interview with Don Hoffman to really get into this. But I have heard of Don Hoffman's theory for a couple years now, and it always just hits me, how this comes back, because this sounds like what Don Hoffman is almost saying here, right? This idea that our conscious or our experience of life, our experience of reality is in of itself an interface, right? And so when we look at the world and when we're trying to understand the world, our cognition, our ability to understand things, our perception of things is in and of itself a manipulation, or not even abstraction, I should say, right? Of that. So like it says here, it's an instrument. Um, Use of an instrument on the thing certainly does not let it be what it is or itself. So it's like our interface of reality, like our reality as an interface, does not actually let the thing be. Like, we can't actually see what the real shape and form or whatever of consciousness is, or whatever is behind the space and time kind of interface. But at the same time, if you look at it the other way, right, cognition is not an instrument of our activity, but more or less passive medium. So being conscious, right, might in and of itself be a portal to the outside world, to this reality where you have these conscious agents, is what Don Hoffman calls them. Um, and again, this sounds so crazy if you if you're not if you're not aware of this theory, so go check it out. It's just all backed by like physics and science and mathematical stuff and game theory and all this other stuff. It's very interesting. But nonetheless, like, a lot of this speaks to me of that, of the idea that our cognition or our consciousness is, either is a tool, where it's either it either forms an interface that doesn't allow us to see life as it actually is, and or it manipulates life, like our very consciousness, like our experience of life, of reality, is in and of itself just one passive perspective. And we're kind of along for the ride. I'm not sure if I'm making sense there, but I don't know, man. This It's just really interesting how it hit there. And the rest of this is very interesting too, but that part, yeah.
Hegel begins the introduction to the phenomenology by situating us within the realm of what we can call epistemological concerns. And this is very much in tune with the sort of grand sweep of modern philosophy, which was in many respects dominated, at least in its theoretical approach. And the theoretical approach really did dictate the practical approach in many cases, by a focus on what it is that we can possibly know and what we're contributing to knowledge, and what conceals the truth from us, what reveals the truth to us. So there's that aspect. Hegel is going to talk about it in terms of cognition or Kantness. And you notice I've got here epistemological preliminaries to philosophy. In modern philosophy, for many of the people involved in it, epistemology really does become first philosophy, as opposed to metaphysics being first philosophy. Now, on the other hand, you can't get away from metaphysics. You can't get away from some sort of connection to being as such, or if you want to put it in terms of other things as well, to meaning, to some sort of overarching good. Hegel will actually talk in terms of the excellent at many points, as we've seen in the preface. And so we've got this absolute over here. And that constitutes sort of another pole to modern philosophy. On the one hand, if you look at figures like Descartes or Locke or Hume or Kant, what you're seeing is this intense emphasis on trying to figure out what it is that we can actually take as starting points, what we can rely upon, if anything, what it is that we, the knower, are doing through our knowing, through our acts of knowledge, through our organizing things, through imposing categories, as Kant says, through associating things, as Hume is going to say.
Speed up a little bit. Sorry.
But at the other, on the other hand, and at another pole, there's also this sense that, look, there's something bigger. There's something that we want to get to. We don't want to just be doing this sort of, essentially navel-gazing activity of enumerating the different ways in which we can get to know things and, the different ways in which we can fail to know things. We want to actually know something. We want to know something not just about individual things, and we don't just want to do science in the sense of, laboratory experiments or engaging in natural history. We want to have a sense of the totality. We want to make sense out of the all. And so Hegel has got these two different moments here, cognition and the absolute. And the question is, what's the relationship between them? So he says it's a natural assumption that in philosophy, what's going on in philosophy, before we get to start to deal with its proper subject matter, the actual cognition of what truly is, so that would be metaphysics. And to a certain degree, that would also involve, say, philosophy of action, moral philosophy, philosophy of human nature. We have to engage in something else. One must first of all come to an understanding about cognition. And he's going to raise this dichotomy here, could it be this or could it be that? Two different possibilities. Do we look at cognition as something like an instrument, an apparatus that we bring to our world out there that we're experiencing, or perhaps turn inward when we're engaging in reflection, and thereby make sense out of things? Is cognition like an instrument? Is there an active sense, a productive sense to what's going on in knowledge, what's going on even in imagination?
He's very much both.
Or is it more like a medium? And when he says medium, he means something like a telescope, or a microscope, or just looking through glass as such, or looking through water. Or, you could think about what we're doing right now as a medium. It's kind of a weird one because it does involve an apparatus, which is doing weird things to, it's breaking down the light into its constituent parts. And I have no idea how a digital camera actually works, quite honestly, if you pressed me upon it. But, we tend to think of it as sort of like a medium. I suppose an analog camera would be much more medium and less apparatus. A digital camera is more apparatus and in some sense less medium. But these are the possibilities. And he says there's a certain uneasiness, a certain worry. Why? Because there's different kinds of cognition. There's different modes of getting to know things. And I think we're more or less familiar with this. Getting to know a person is a different kind of knowing than knowing how to sing a song, or knowing that 2 + 2 = 4. Those are different types of cognition there. And we don't have to worry about trying to enumerate them right now. That's not the point that Hegel's trying to make. He just wants to say, look, there's different kinds of cognition, and so perhaps one type of cognition might be more appropriate than another for cognizing the absolute. And, that would make sense. Are you going to be able to understand the absolute through the processes of natural science? Probably not. Are you going to be able to do it through mathematics? We've already seen Hegel tackle that sort of thing back in the preface. Are you going to be able to do it through intuition? Hegel says no, because intuition is really just sort of random, whatever it is that we happen to feel at the time, and we kind of rationalize it, or we endow it with some dignity by thinking that it's revealing something to us. No, there's going to be a different kind of cognition involved, and the question is, well, what is that going to be? So he says, we could make a bad choice of means. We could pick the wrong way to go about figuring out what actually is the case. Not just what's the case right here or right now, but what's the case in toto, in the totality of things, including us. So it matters whether we pick an instrument
And Toto.
or a medium. And this was really, an epistemological point. You could say that modern philosophy is dominated by this worry, by this concern about, wait a second, people have been saying that this is the way we get to know reality, this is the way we get to know the world, this is the way we get to know ourselves, this is the way we get to know God, if there is such a thing. Maybe, we're picking the wrong one. We have to be very careful, and we need to look at this end of things and figure out which ones are the appropriate ones. And if you look at some of the thinkers who I've mentioned, like John Locke, for example, or Immanuel Kant, or René Descartes, they are really focused, also Benedict Spinoza, really focused on figuring out what modes of cognition we ought to be using for what kinds of purposes. So Hegel goes on and he says, cognition is a faculty of a definite kind and scope, so if we don't have a precise definition of its nature and limits, we might grasp clouds of error rather than the heaven of truth. And again, that is the nightmare of epistemological, speculation in the modern period. Maybe we're really insane. Maybe we're really being deceived by an evil, evil genius, evil demon. That's coming from Descartes, right? Descartes didn't really think that, by the way, but that's what a lot of people have taken from Descartes. Maybe we can't rely on causality at all. Maybe that's just our brains or our minds just associating things that aren't really totally dependable. That's Hume's point. And then, Kant resolves that by saying, oh, don't worry about causality. It's not really out there in the world. We're imposing that on experience so that it can be experienced for us through the categories of the understanding. But you see this theme over and over again. We got to look at this stuff here before we worry about getting to the absolute. We have to really get this issue settled, or else we're going to pick the wrong thing, and we're going to be like the rest of those dummies through the history of philosophy who didn't have the right idea about this. That's another typical modern conception, that we can break with the past like that. So he says, this feeling of uneasiness is surely bound to be transformed into the conviction that the whole project of securing for consciousness, that's us, through cognition what exists in itself is absurd, and there's a boundary between cognition and the absolute that completely separates them. This is skepticism. This is skepticism of a sort which says we can never really get to this thing over here that's most real because there's always something in the way, and that something is the way in which we get to know the absolute. Now you can say, well, how do you know about that knowledge and about the absolute? And that's where Hegel's going with this. So he says, if cognition is an instrument for getting a hold of absolute being, we've got a problem, don't we? What happens when we use an instrument? Does an instrument leave alone what it is that it's working upon? It really depends on what kind of instrument, doesn't it? Think about what goes on with this camera. Are you getting the whole picture of what's going on here?
Nope.
Not exactly. There's editing software. Usually the light is not good enough, the way the camera's taking it, so I boost it up a little bit. The sound is usually not quite as strong as I'd like it to be, so I boost that up a bit as well. There's capacities for modifying what it is that you're supposed to be taking in. And, if you think about a camera, again, when you turn the camera towards something, you're selecting out a portion of what it is that's in your visual field. It's kind of interesting, too. I think about... I go to heavy metal concerts because I love heavy metal. Some of you may know that already. And one of the things that I do, and I'm kind of, a typical guy this way, a typical guy of the 21st century, is I get my iPhone and I'll only do this a few times in the concert, but when I have an inkling that it's going to be a really great song, then I got the iPhone up and I'm recording it. Now, I'm looking through that viewfinder thing, and later on I can watch that. So, maybe it's Judas Priest and they're playing Living After Midnight, or, The Rage, or something like that. And I am not taking in the same thing that the spectacle on stage actually is sort of presenting to me. I'm looking at a little screen, aren't I? As opposed to, sort of just taking it in. And there's something about the act of interposing the camera there that changes the experience as well. Now I got to concentrate on trying to hold it steady. And funny enough, because we never get super great seats like front row, because those are very expensive. You can see when I'm taking my film or my image of it, that there'll be some other people in front of me, and you can see their screens lit up, filming the same thing. So that's a sort of prime example. We could think of many other examples. The point is that an instrument modifies the thing that it is working upon. So Hegel will say, if cognition is the instrument for getting hold of absolute being, if our active, not knowing or investigating is how we get to know absolute being, if it's active like that, then the use of an instrument on a thing certainly does not let it be what it is for itself. So we're not getting what it is in itself. Instead, we're getting what it is for cognition, or what it is for us, or what it is for this particular instrument of cognition. So he says it reshapes it and alters it. We're not getting what it is that we wanted to in the first place. This is the dialectic at work, by the way. You think that you're doing X, and it turns out that you're not just doing X, you're also doing Y, and Y kind of screws up what's going on with X, so that X doesn't turn out to be what you were doing at all, just what you intended to do. Now he says, so that's a problem. What if cognition is just a medium? What if it's something like, seeing through a window, or hearing? We hear through the air. The sound waves impinge upon us. The air is the medium. The sound waves are what are carried into our ears. And so I've drawn sort of arrows here. That seems to be, like the absolute is coming to us then, and the medium is not really doing anything. It says it's a more or less passive medium through which the light of truth reaches us. But the problem is, we don't get the light of truth as it is in itself. What we get is what that medium allows to pass through. So think of it as sort of a filtering system. If you change the air, you change the sound. As a matter of fact, this is a great example, sound, because one of the reasons why I have to tweak the sound as I process these videos is because the acoustics in this place where I'm shooting are not particularly good, and there's some background noise, so there's some other things going on here. And other places where I shoot, it might sound very echoey. That's because the medium is not quite the same. So if we're doing that with knowledge, if knowledge is a medium through which the light of truth just sort of comes through, if we're not making an active contribution to it, we're still getting it through some sort of filtering, through some sort of selection process, one that we're not really conscious of. So, take, for example, light. We look at flowers. Flowers are very beautiful. I love flowers. I'm very interested in them and growing them and sniffing them and looking at them. I even wanted to be a florist at one time, believe it or not.
Oh, wow.
We don't see flowers the way that bees do we? Bees can see into the ultraviolet. And it turns out that when you put flowers under ultraviolet lights, and you look at them with an ultraviolet camera, you can see that it doesn't look quite the same. Same with butterflies. Also, smell. I'm sure that the flowers smell very different to bees than they do to us. Same with taste. So the medium can also end up being a kind of contributor. And again, we're dealing with how it is for us, and we're not dealing with the absolute as it is in itself in that case. So he says, either way we employ a means which immediately brings about the opposite of its own end. That means that we're trying to do something, but we're somewhat self-defeating in what we're trying to do because we're picking a tool or a means. We're picking something that is going to prevent us from actually being able to do what it is that we intend to do. So again, this is the dialectic at work. The fact that we can register this, the fact that we can understand this, the fact that we can make sense of this, that's the dialectic. So he says, it seems rather absurd we should make use of a means at all. So he says, how could we get around this? This evil could be remedied, this badness could be dealt with, through an acquaintance with the way in which the instrument works. So that's what epistemology does. It looks at the mind, or it looks at the act of knowledge, or it looks at the human being, and says, how does this knowing, this investigating, this coming to understand, how does that work? Let's focus on that. Before we worry about what it is that we're knowing, let's figure out, how does knowledge actually work? How does thinking actually work? And that's this grand movement of epistemology. So we can focus on the instrument, or we can focus on the medium. And with both the instrument and the medium, one tack that we can take is we can say, let's try to figure out what, in fact, this is adding in, and then we'll just subtract that. So once we know that it's doing this to the object that we're working upon, we'll just take that part away, and then we've got the object as it is in itself for us. Or, with the medium. If we know that the medium is turning everything yellow, let's take that yellowness out, and then we'll have the absolute restored to us.
It's hard to figure out what
that is.
Is that
going to work? He says, if we remove from a reshaped thing what the instrument has done to it. So we're taking the absolute as we're getting it through the instrument, and we're trying to remove the effects of the instrument so that we get the absolute by itself. He says, it becomes exactly what it was before this effort. We didn't know what the hell this was in the first place. That's what we're trying to figure out through knowing, right? So if we try to take out what the instrument does, we're actually removing the part that tells us about what's over here. And we can say the same thing with the medium. He says, by testing cognition, which we conceive of as a medium, if we get to know the law of its refraction, we're using a visual metaphor here, it's useless to subtract this from the end result, for it's not the refraction of the ray, but the ray itself whereby truth reaches us, and that is cognition. So if we're removing that, all we would get is a pure direction or a blank space. We wouldn't get something that we can actually work with. Now, there's a third possibility that Hegel considers in terms of instrument. He says maybe the instrument is less intrusive than we think. Maybe it's, and he's got this metaphor here that a lot of us probably can't relate to too well. Maybe it's like, a lime stick catching a bird and bringing it close to us. Now, a lime stick is a sticky stick, right? So imagine something like flypaper, only on a stick, and you see a bird down there, and you're like, yeah, I'm going to catch that bird. And you touch it with the stick, and now the bird can't get away. So, think of something like a butterfly net or a live trap or, whatever works for you. And you're bringing the thing to you, undamaged, unaltered, maybe screwed up a little bit, panicked, whatever's going to happen with the bird or insect. You're going to do that now with the absolute. So the instrument is just to grab onto the absolute and bring it in over here. Hegel says this is a ruse, this is a trick. He
Can't
says,
see how it interacts with the system, the environment.
The absolute would laugh at our little ruse if it were not with us in and for itself all along and of its own volition. That's an interesting thing to say. That means that the absolute, without us realizing it, is already over here. And here's a little bit of the story, where we're going with this. The absolute is getting to know itself through us, through our processes of cognition, through what it is that we're trying to make sense of, through how we're improving, over time, this process. So the instrument is not so innocent, it's not so undamaging, it's not so unintrusive as we thought that it was when we made it out to be. But it's not the end of the story. So Hegel is going to finish up this section by saying that none of these are actually ways of thinking about this that are actually going to work for us. So what are we actually left with here? Should we just stop doing epistemology altogether and say, well, let's just jump right into the absolute? Well, that's not going to work. Now that we've brought up this worry, we're going to be inhabited by it for a while until we can resolve this worry. And that's part of what the introduction is really grappling with. So this first section here, it's not encapsulating the entire introduction, but it is setting the stage for all the other themes that are going to emerge in this section.
Okay. Nice. Real quick.
Meanwhile, if the fear of falling into error...
That does, once again, remind me of Don Hoffman's thing is our interface, the way we see the world, the way we perceive the world is like an interface that is in of itself an abstraction from what's out there, right? And his idea of, Hegel's idea of the absolute, kind of knowing itself through us. That's a very popular quote now. I wonder who that came. I'm not sure if it came from Hegel or some other folks. Let me look it up. We are the universe's way of knowing itself, right? Observing itself, experiencing itself. There's a lot of... Oh, is it Alan Watts? Interesting. I wonder if he came up with that for himself, seen it from other things. Carl Sagan, talked about this too. Okay. Yeah, I gotta look this up later, but I want to see where that came from because it seems it's something that's often reiterated in many of these, kind of philosophies and things like that, of us discovering that, or making this conclusion, or at least making this insight, right? And it seems like this is such a core truth. This is such a truth that comes back to us over and over again that it seems to be a lot of truth there, right? Whatever ways we use to understand the world, the universe, is also the universe understanding us and therefore itself, which is it's just so amazing. But yeah, let's go ahead and
sets up a mistrust of science, which in the absence of such scruples gets on with the work itself and actually cognizes something. It is hard to see why we should not turn round and mistrust this very mistrust. Should we not be concerned as to whether this fear of error is not just the error itself? Indeed, this fear takes something, a great deal in fact, for granted as truth, supporting its scruples and inferences on what is itself in need of prior scrutiny to see if it is true. To be specific...
It sounds just like a lot of people today, unfortunately, where people have a huge distrust in science because they don't understand what science is. They think science is just certainty, just oh yeah, we know this and this is will never change. That's what we know. And if something changes, you're like, oh, I thought you said it was this, blah 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 blah, right? Like you see that with vaccines, you see that with a lot of things in our world. And the reality is that science is a process of knowing, right? It's a process of understanding and gaining knowledge and things like that. And because of that, the results that you get from that process isn't science in and of itself. It's the result of science, right? And therefore, those results can change, right? As our process gets better, as we do our process more and more, and we figure out more and more things, and we realize, oh, what we thought we saw, the result we thought we got before, was actually incorrect, or was actually, there was, some errors there, right? So really, the bigger problem is not that our process creates errors or it can be wrong. It's that people fear when we're wrong, right? People have this assumption that we can't be wrong, or that you know, um, if we find ourselves to be wrong, then the entire thing is wrong. The entire process is wrong. The entire process is can't be trusted, and that's the problem. So I definitely like it that he brought that up here.
It takes for granted certain ideas about cognition as an instrument and as a medium, and assumes that there is a difference between ourselves and this cognition. Above all, it presupposes that the absolute stands on one side and cognition on the other, independent, separated from it, and yet is something real. Or in other words, it presupposes that cognition, which, since it's excluded from the absolute, is surely outside of the truth as well, is nevertheless true, an assumption whereby what calls itself fear of error reveals itself rather as fear of the truth.
Mm, right way of putting it.
One way to address the problem of skepticism, this worry that we can never really know anything because what we take to be knowledge isn't really so, or the processes by which we're coming to know things are somehow distorting them or falsifying them. One way to deal with that is to suggest that skepticism itself needs to be skeptical of that very skepticism. Now that's rather self-reflexive to say that, but so let me say that one more time. You can say that skepticism is self-defeating by the way in which it makes sense out of the very problem of knowledge. Or put in other terms, skepticism, which seems to be saying, well, you're making assumptions and we don't want to make assumptions, is making a whole bunch of assumptions itself. And this characterizes the movement of modern epistemology that Hegel is kind of undoing in this section. So he says, the fear of falling into error sets up a mistrust of science. And now you've got, he's not talking about this here, but you've got sort of a divided consciousness. You've got, people who are actually doing things. Science actually cognizes something. Doesn't necessarily have to be the absolute. It could just be the objects of the natural sciences. It could be, psychology, looking at the human mind, its makeup, how it works. Could be history, right? But there's science. There's some sort of discipline, and it's getting to know things. And those who are involved with that are not worried so much about falling into error, although they may be, suspicious. If you're doing historical research, you have to be a bit credulous of certain documents and certain claims. But they're actually getting on with the work, and they're getting to know things in the process. Are they knowing them perfectly? Perhaps not. Do they sometimes make mistakes? Yes, that's true. But they're not paralyzed by this fear of error that keeps them from actually doing anything.
Mm-hmm.
And, if you want to think about this in non-scientific terms, but in relationship terms. Think about, convincing yourself that somebody loves you or not. So if you're going to wait to act for the, absolute certainty that this person loves you before you enter into a relationship with them and, date and get to know them and get married and have a life together and all this sort of stuff, well, you're never going to do it, right? Mm-hmm. Because the very getting on with it and getting to know them is part of how you figure it out in the first place.
Exactly.
And if you just worry about, I got to be 100% certain about this, you'll never get the opportunity to be 100% certain. And it works that way with disciplinary knowledge of the world as well.
That was a really great freaking metaphor there, because like he said there, it's not just that you will never discover that love, you will never actually know that love until you get on with it, but you don't actually create that love, right, until you get on with it. It's like the very action of being in a relationship allows you the opportunity to create that love, right? And that's something I've been talking about with my partner. We're almost 7 years, and we constantly are talking about like how amazing it is that like she had a huge crush on me when I was in high school, and I kind of viewed her as like a friend. She loves to tell that story, but after I graduated, about 2 years afterwards, we met again, um, and we just had this like moment, like that, stereotypical moment. You look into each other's eyes and boom, explosions, whatever. Um, and it very much felt like that, but it's that's not what carried us on, right? That initial thing is like a infatuation almost, or like a oh wow, oh shit moment, right? But when we're trying to create a relationship, when we say okay, let's be together, right? What does that take? It creates, it took the action. It took every step of the way of deciding, oh, we're going to communicate, or we're going to go on dates, or we're going to, learn more about each other. We're going to support each other. We're going to help each other grow, right? It's a process of getting to know each other, and because of that, you can create that love, right? And if there is no love there, right, part of that is not just that there's no love there, it's also realizing that you don't really want to fall in love with this person, right? Like for a relationship that you realize that you don't love a person, you realize that the only thing you like about them is, some physical thing, right? Or some financial thing or some other thing. And you don't actually want to go through the process of creating that loving relationship because it's just not compatible or whatever. So for me, I see love as a process, as a thing that you create, right? As a result of going through a process, and a process in and of itself, right? And similarly for here, the absolute, or the learning knowledge and truth, gaining truth, is the process, but it's also the result of the process. It's kind of both, right? I guess it goes back into that dialectic. But the thing that you're doing to learn about the world is the thing that you're learning about the world, and it feeds back into the system that you're using to learn more about the world, right? So yeah, that's very phenomenal there. I really like that.
So he says, we should perhaps distrust this very mistrust. Why? Should we not be concerned as to whether this fear of error is not just the error itself? It's a mistake to be so obsessed with getting it 100% right, with attaining perfect certainty and only then moving on, or only sticking within the realm of that which we can be 99.99999% sure about. Hegel's really being a pragmatist here in many respects. And I don't mean just a pragmatist like William James, I mean a pragmatist like Blaise Pascal or Maurice Blondel as well. So he says, indeed, this fear takes something, a great deal in fact, for granted as truth. What is it taking for granted as truth? All this part down here. And this is what we just looked at before, right? We've got ourselves, cognition as either an instrument or a medium, and the absolute. And we're supposed to use this instrument to grasp what's real, what's true over here. And so we've got, reality or truth. And now the implication here is that there is actually some sort of bar between the instrument, the medium, how we're getting to know the reality or truth, so that this is actually, in some respect, false. There's another assumption being made too, which is that we are not that cognition. We are something different than cognition, when actually we are that. That is part of what we are. So there's these sort of artificial separations that are being imposed by this point of view. And that's part of why it gets itself into such a tizzy about this. He says, it assumes there's a difference between ourselves and this cognition, and it presupposes the absolute stands on one side, cognition on the other, independent and separated from it, and yet is something real. And it presupposes the cognition, which is surely outside of the truth, right, which is false, is also at the same time true. Because it is really cognition, it is really what it is. But then does this dividing line really hold up? We know something about the cognition. He says, it presupposes that cognition, which since it's excluded from the absolute, is outside of the truth, is nevertheless true, an assumption whereby what calls itself fear of error reveals itself instead as fear of the truth. And I want to just spend just a moment here to go a little bit beyond this and shoot into some of the other sections. When Hegel's talking about truth here, truth is something you can think of as bleeding over outside of the absolute. This isn't the best way to put it because the absolute does encompass everything. We're already inside of the absolute, but we just don't realize it. But truth bleeds out of that and gets into all these other things as well. So there's more truth that we have access to than we know what to do with. We're not able to recognize the true and all of the interconnections between the true as such. So we take it to be false, and then we're worried about it. We get scared, and then we don't do anything, and we say, I need to withdraw instead. And so long as we do this, and we keep to ourselves, we're never going to get to know the absolute.
Beautiful. Really fantastic. I'm excited. I'm excited to get more into this. Another great section. Man, I'm really curious as to what people had a problem with Hegel. I mean, I get it. I think I'm getting it like with the from historical sense, but I don't know. A lot of this is making a lot of sense. Um, and greatly thanks to Dr. Sattler, because if it wasn't for him, I'd be having a hard time, really getting through this. But yeah, this is fantastic. So that's it for now. Um, Thanks as always for watching with me, for learning with me. Let me know what you learned in the comments below. And yeah, this is fantastic. Thanks again, and have a great day. See ya. Bye bye.